Have you ever noticed that the people who hurt you the most seem to live rent-free in your mind long after they're gone? Not because you want them there, but because something about the pain they caused never got resolved. Maybe it was a betrayal. Maybe it was the silence after you opened your heart. Maybe it was the way they walked away like nothing ever mattered. And here you are, still carrying it. Still spinning it in your mind, still trying to make sense of what they did and why it cut so deep. What if I told you that the pain isn't random, that it's not just about what they did, but about what it revealed in you? Carl Jung believed that emotional pain, especially the kind triggered by others, is a message from the unconscious. Not a curse, not a punishment. A message, a coded invitation to look deeper, not outward, but inward. And until you learn to read that message, you'll keep hurting long after they've forgotten your name. That's the thing about wounds. They echo. They don't just sit quietly in the past, they reach forward, into your relationships, into your choices, into the voice you hear in your head when you're doubting yourself. You think you're angry at them, but you're really angry at the part of yourself that let it happen, that didn't see it coming, that didn't protect you. Or maybe you did see it, but stayed anyway. Jung wrote that what you resist not only persists, it grows stronger. That's what happens when you try to avoid pain by focusing on the person who caused it. The more energy you give to them, the more power they hold. And that's the trap. That's how revenge poisons you from the inside. You don't heal by proving something to them. You heal by transforming what they activated in you. You're not haunted by them, you're haunted by what they awakened. The ego doesn't like hearing that. The ego wants control, it wants to be right, it wants justice, retaliation, proof. The ego says, if they hurt me, I need to show them, I need to make them feel what I felt. But here's the truth. The ego doesn't want healing, it wants repetition. It wants a familiar script with a different ending. But that ending never comes. Because the script is flawed. That script was written in childhood, in those early moments when love was conditional, when approval came with strings, when you learned, often silently, that being yourself was not enough. And so you adapted, you performed, you anticipated rejection, you begged for crumbs of affection, and every time someone betrayed or belittled or ignored you, it confirmed the story you didn't even know you were still telling yourself. I'm not worth staying for. That's why it hurts so much, not because of them, because of what it touches. Carl Jung spoke often about the inner child, not in the way pop psychology does, but as a living, breathing archetype inside you, a memory with emotion, a frozen moment in time that still trembles every time something similar happens. When someone withdraws, you don't just feel the loss of that person, you feel all the times you've been abandoned. You feel the echo. That's the complexity of hurt. It's layered, and those layers belong to you. But here's the twist. The people who hurt you are not just villains in your story. They are mirrors. They reflect back to you the parts of yourself you've rejected, abandoned, or never fully understood. Jung called this the shadow, the unconscious self, made up of everything we refuse to see or accept in ourselves. And when someone wounds you deeply, they often do so by pressing on a shadow you haven't yet brought to light. Let's say you feel crushed by someone's arrogance. Ask yourself, where have you disowned your own pride or your right to take up space? Let's say you're devastated by their indifference. Where have you suppressed your own need for care and presence? I'm not saying they were right. I'm saying they were revealing. That's the difference between pain and transformation. One keeps you stuck in the past, the other gives you access to something buried, something real. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. There's a part of you that might still be clinging to the identity of the victim, not because you're weak, but because the victim archetype feels safe. It gives you a narrative. It says, this happened to me, and that's why I am the way I am. It gives you a reason not to change, not to trust, not to risk. It gives you the illusion of power by blaming everything on them. But victimhood is a cage with a velvet lining. Jung warned us about this. He saw that when people stay in the victim role too long, they give away their agency. They become dependent on being wronged to feel significant. And that dependency becomes toxic. The truth? You are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to become because of it. That's where the real revenge begins. Not in retaliation, not in silence meant to punish, but in detachment, in healing, in the kind of inner alchemy that turns pain into clarity, wounds into wisdom, and grief into growth. When you begin to do shadow work, everything changes. You stop asking, "Why did they do this to me?" and start asking, "What did this awaken in me that needs to be integrated?" Not needing their apology, you stop waiting for closure, you stop chasing ghosts with open wounds. Instead, you start reclaiming the parts of yourself you lost trying to be loved by them, the parts you hid to stay acceptable, the voice you silenced, the strength you buried under your own fear of being too much or not enough. And as you do that, you become someone else. Not harder, not colder, but deeper, quieter, more powerful. You walk differently, you speak differently. People feel it, even if they can't explain it. And the ones who once knew exactly how to manipulate you, they start to lose their grip, not because you fought back, but because you're no longer playing. The energy changes. You're no longer responding from the wound, you're responding from the whole. That's the essence of individuation. Jung's name for the process of becoming your true integrated self. And nothing is more dangerous to those who once fed off your pain than your wholeness. Because when you stop hurting, they lose their script. When you stop playing the role they cast you in, everything shifts. The dynamics crumble, the patterns collapse, because your participation was always the glue holding it together. You think they had the power? No. They had access. Access to your wounds, your insecurities, your unhealed stories. But once you begin the work of integration, once you stop reacting and start reflecting, that access is denied. And that, right there, is the most powerful revenge you'll ever deliver. A version of you that no longer bleeds from the same place. But let's be honest, this isn't easy. It's not glamorous. It doesn't give you the satisfaction of watching them suffer, of proving you are right, of hearing them say the words you always needed to hear. It doesn't feed the ego, it starves it. Because true healing requires that you abandon the fantasy that someone else's regret will restore your worth. It won't. Even if they apologize, even if they change. It won't undo what was triggered in you. That part is yours, and until you take responsibility for it, you're still handing them the pen to write your story. Jung said that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. That includes the part of you that stayed too long, that kept forgiving, that rationalized red flags, that ignored your own intuition because the fear of being alone was louder than the pain of staying. You're not just healing from what they did, you're healing from what you allowed, what you tolerated, what you thought you needed in order to be worthy. And when you face that truth without shame, something incredible happens. You stop blaming, not because they didn't do wrong, but because you're no longer using that blame to avoid your own growth. You start to see pain differently, not as an enemy, but as an informant, a messenger, a psychological mirror. And in that mirror, you don't just see the wound, you see the lesson. You see the pattern. You see the part of yourself that's still developing, still trying to understand what love actually means when it's not confused with control, performance, or survival. Let's talk about shadow projection, because this is where things get even deeper. Jung believed that the qualities we reject in ourselves get pushed into the unconscious, and from there, they don't disappear, they project outward. Which means the people who hurt you the most often carry traits you haven't integrated within yourself. That doesn't mean they're off the hook. It means they're part of your symbolic language, showing you what's been denied in your own psyche. For example, maybe you're furious at their selfishness, but ask yourself, Where have you suppressed your own needs to be liked? Maybe you're disgusted by their manipulation, but where have you learned to control through people-pleasing or passive aggression because you were too afraid to speak directly? Maybe you're shattered by their coldness, but where have you abandoned your own inner child in the name of appearing strong? These are not easy questions, but they are liberating ones, because every trigger becomes a trailhead. Every emotional explosion becomes a map back to the parts of you still waiting to be met. That's the essence of shadow work, not demonizing what hurts, but decoding it, making the unconscious conscious. And when you do that, you reclaim the energy that was being siphoned off by unexamined pain, energy that was being spent on rumination, fantasy, revenge, obsession, or emotional paralysis. Now that energy is yours again, and with it comes clarity. You stop confusing closure with contact. You stop interpreting silence as rejection. You stop trying to decode someone else's actions through the lens of your own unmet needs, and instead you begin to meet those needs within yourself. You begin to parent your inner child. You begin to protect your boundaries without guilt. You begin to say no without explaining. You begin to honor what your body feels before your mind tries to negotiate it away. And as that trust within yourself grows, your tolerance for emotional chaos shrinks. You no longer chase people to understand why they hurt you, because you understand that pain is not always personal. Sometimes it's ancestral, sometimes it's patterned, sometimes it's projection, and sometimes it's just two unconscious people colliding in a moment of karmic recognition. That doesn't excuse it, but it does explain it. An explanation is power. It gives you back your center. And when you're centered, you can't be baited. You can't be manipulated. You don't take the hook because you see the hook. You don't bleed on the bait. You breathe. You pause. You observe. And that's when people start to notice a change. Not in how loud you are, but in how still you've become. Stillness is terrifying to people who were used to pulling your string. Jung said that individuation is not for the faint-hearted. It's a death of the false self, a funeral for the persona, a confrontation with everything you tried to avoid. But on the other side of that death is something sacred: wholeness. You become someone who cannot be easily defined, controlled, or dismissed, because you are no longer edited by other people's projections. That's the real revenge. Not becoming colder, but becoming clearer. Not becoming numb, but becoming discerning. Not retreating in bitterness, but rising in boundaried grace. You don't need them to hurt like you did. You need to stop hurting yourself by holding on to what they represented. Let them go. Not for them, but for the version of you that is still waiting for someone else's pain to validate your own. You are not here to prove your worth through pain. You are here to remember it in spite of pain. That's the great paradox of healing. The wound doesn't define you, but it refines you. It strips away illusion. It forces you to reckon with what you thought love was and to rebuild from truth, not trauma. You don't become unbreakable by avoiding pain. You become unbreakable by no longer fearing it, by no longer fearing the parts of yourself that hurt, long, ache, and rage. Because those parts are sacred too. They are the gateway to your power. They are the parts that got frozen in time, waiting for you to come back, not to rescue them, but to reintegrate them, to say you belong. That's the final alchemy. When nothing is exiled, when no part of you is seen as too broken to be loved, when you become the one you were waiting for, not perfect, not invulnerable, but whole. And whole people, they can't be broken by others, because nothing is missing. When you reach that point of wholeness, something even more profound happens. People start responding to you differently, not because you changed your voice or your posture or your personality, but because your energy no longer leaks. You're no longer sending out unconscious signals that say, please love me, please validate me, or please don't leave. That energy was once invisible to you, but palpable to others. It made you a target for those who sensed your unspoken hunger, the ones who fed your hopes just enough to keep you tethered, only to withdraw when you got too close. That dance ends when you no longer need the performance. You begin to feel your worth not as a reaction, but as a resting state, quiet, stable, uncompromised. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of presence. True presence comes not from charisma or perfection, but from integration. The man or woman who has faced their shadow and emerged intact does not need to dominate a room. They alter the room simply by being in it. That's not mystical fluff, it's psychological law. When your unconscious is no longer spilling into your reactions, you stop being readable, you stop being programmable. People don't know how to pull your strings anymore because the strings no longer exist. That's when manipulative people disappear, not because you push them away, but because they can no longer access the parts of you that used to play their game. Think about that for a second. The people who once drained you, haunted you, baited you, where did they go? Why did they fade? Because when you stopped needing their role in your drama, they stopped showing up. This is the invisible power of individuation. Not just healing what happened, but dissolving the psychic contracts that kept you recreating it. You no longer chase the father who never came back. You stop repeating the patterns of a mother who taught you that love must be earned through sacrifice. You stop reenacting the old betrayal script with new characters. You don't need the karmic loop anymore, because you've learned what you were supposed to learn, that your pain was never asking for revenge, it was asking for recognition. That recognition is what liberates you, and once you are free, the way you move through the world changes. You don't seek apologies, you don't write long unsent letters, you don't fantasize about being seen by the one who couldn't see you. You've outgrown it. Not with arrogance, but with clarity. Clarity that says, I finally see myself, and that's enough. That moment is sacred. It's the moment when your unconscious stops hijacking your present. With echoes from the past, you begin to choose from wholeness, not from hunger. You begin to respond with intention, not impulse. And that terrifies people who depended on your reactivity to stay in control. Because here's what most people don't understand about healing. It's not loud. It doesn't need announcement. It doesn't come with a performance. It's silent. It's subtle. It's sovereign. And it sends a shockwave through the lives of those who once fed off your confusion. Suddenly, they can't read you. They can't guilt you. They can't shame you into shrinking back down to a size that made them feel safe. You're no longer explaining your worth, you're embodying it, and in that embodiment you become a mirror. And people hate mirrors when they're not ready to see themselves. Jung knew this well. He worked with patients who were terrified to confront the aspects of themselves they had buried for decades. The shadow is not evil, it's simply unloved, but the longer it remains in the dark, the more power it gathers. It sabotages relationships, it twists your desires, it poisons your choices. That's why betrayal hits so hard. It reveals a part of you you were trying not to see. Maybe the part that tolerates disrespect. Maybe the part that craves attention more than authenticity. Maybe the part that still believes love must hurt, and in that moment you have a choice. Defend the ego or liberate the soul. Liberation is not glamorous. It doesn't look like revenge. It looks like walking away without needing to prove anything. It looks like choosing your peace over their approval. It looks like deleting the number and not checking if they noticed. It looks like unfollowing, unhooking, unmasking. Not because you're bitter, but because you're clear. Clear that you don't need to convince anyone of your value. Clear that your worth isn't something they get to debate. Clear that their inability to love you was never a reflection of your inadequacy. It was a revelation of their limitation. And once you see that, it's over. The old game collapses. The urge to retaliate dissolves, not because you're passive, but because you're powerful. You're not rising above them. You're rising out of the narrative that kept you bound to them. You're not avoiding conflict. You're transcending the need to engage at all. Because now you understand the best revenge is not in their pain, it's in your peace. It's not in their regret, it's in your rebirth. And that rebirth is sacred. It's when you no longer define yourself by what you survived, but by what you've chosen to become. Not a victim, not a martyr, not even a warrior, but an integrated being, a self-awareness, self-guided, self-honoring soul who no longer gives away energy to prove, to punish, or to please. That is the most terrifying thing to those who tried to break you, because they depended on your brokenness to feel powerful, and now that you're whole, they're irrelevant. Jung once said, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." And in that spirit, your healing doesn't need to be posted or announced or flaunted. Let them wonder. Let them feel the absence of the old version of you. Let them sit with the silence that replaced your reactions. That's the power of detachment. Not coldness, not distance, but freedom. The freedom to feel deeply and still walk away. The freedom to grieve fully and still let go. The freedom to love yourself more than you need to be understood. That's what they don't teach you about healing. It's not about becoming untouchable. It's about becoming so deeply in touch with yourself that nothing external can destabilize you anymore. It's about feeling the pain, honoring it, learning from it, and then choosing not to stay in it. That choice is everything. That's where your power lives. And when you start living from that place, you stop attracting people who feed on pain. You stop inviting in relationships that echo your trauma. You start to vibrate on a frequency that only resonates with truth, with depth, with mutuality. You stop needing revenge because you realize the pain was never the end of your story. It was the beginning of your transformation. This transformation doesn't always look impressive from the outside. It's not flashy. You won't always get applause for it. Sometimes you'll be misunderstood even more. People who once had access to you might say you've changed, that you're cold now, distant, or not the same. And they're right. You're not the same. But not because you've become bitter, because you've become boundaried, because you've stopped leaking your energy into spaces that didn't hold you, because you've realized that not everyone deserves an explanation, a response, or a place in your story. And maybe for the first time, you're okay with being misunderstood because you no longer need to be seen by them. You've learned to see yourself. You no longer crave that familiar chaos just to feel something. You no longer equate intensity with intimacy. And because of that, a whole new reality begins to open up. A quieter one, but far more powerful. One where peace is no longer something you beg for, but something you protect. Where clarity is no longer something you wait for, but something you create. Carl Jung spoke of the danger of living a life dictated by unconscious forces. He said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Think about that. How many times have you found yourself saying, "Why does this always happen to me?" Or, "Why do I keep attracting the same kind of people?" That's not fate. That's the shadow at work. That's your unhealed wounds pulling you into familiar dynamics, not because you're weak, but because some part of you still believes those dynamics are love. Breaking that cycle is not just about awareness, it's about embodiment. You can't just know better, you have to feel different. And feeling different takes time. It takes space. It takes grieving not just what was done to you, but who you became to survive it. It takes mourning the masks you wore, the boundaries you didn't set, the voice you silenced. And in that mourning, a new self begins to emerge, not the version of you that never got hurt, but the version that was forged in the fire and came out whole. That's why individuation isn't about perfection, it's about integration. It's about taking the fragmented parts of yourself, the inner child, the repressed anger, the unspoken needs, and welcoming them back into your awareness. Not to let them take over, but to stop running from them. Because the parts of you that were once denied are not your enemies, they are the keys to your authenticity. And when you reclaim them, you become someone who is no longer defined by pain, but by presence. Presence is what changes the game. It's what makes people pause when you speak, even if your words are few. It's what makes manipulators back off without you raising your voice. It's what creates an invisible boundary that says, I see through this, and I won't play. That kind of presence doesn't come from pretending to be strong. It comes from facing the parts of yourself that once felt weak and discovering they were never weak to begin with. They were just unacknowledged, undernourished, waiting for you to come home. When you finally do, everything aligns. Not in a magical, problem-free way, but in a way that feels grounded. You stop forcing things. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop abandoning yourself just to keep the peace. And in that new space, the right people begin to find you. The ones who don't flinch at your depth. The ones who don't need you to shrink so they can feel big. The ones who see your silence not as distance, but as discernment. These are the people who don't need you to bleed to prove your love. They meet you in the wholeness you fought to reclaim. But let's be honest, there are days when you'll miss the chaos, when you'll feel the pull to go back to the familiar, to chase, to fix, to prove. Healing is not linear, and the ego doesn't give up easily. There will be moments when you want them to see how much you've grown, when you want them to regret losing you, when you crave the validation that never came. That's okay. Let it pass through you. Don't judge it, but don't act on it either. Feel it. Breathe. Let it rise and fall. And remember, their recognition was never the goal. Your self-recognition was. That's what makes this path so radical. It strips away every illusion you clung to for comfort. The illusion that love must be earned. The illusion that your value is based on how much you endure. The illusion that closure comes from others. And once those illusions fall away, what's left is something terrifyingly beautiful. The truth. And the truth is that you are enough. Not because someone else says so, but because you've said it to yourself over and over. In the quiet, in the dark, in the moments no one saw. Jung believed that the unconscious holds everything we need to become whole. Not just the wounds, but the wisdom. Not just the pain, but the purpose. Your triggers, your patterns, your fears, they're not just obstacles. They're road signs. They're showing you where your work is, where your light wants to shine. That's why healing from emotional hurt isn't about going backward or fixing the past. It's about bringing what was unconscious into the light so it no longer controls you. And once that happens, you don't need to control anyone else either. You stop trying to make people see your value. You stop arguing with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop looking for revenge, not because they didn't deserve consequences, but because you've outgrown the need for them to feel what you've felt. That need was a reflection of your pain, and now that the pain is no longer driving you, the need disappears too. Instead, you choose something far more powerful, peace. Not the kind that comes from avoidance, but the kind that comes from integration, from knowing you faced yourself and didn't look away, from knowing you held your own hand through the storm, from knowing you chose healing when revenge would have been easier. That's the kind of peace that can't be taken from you, because it's not dependent on anyone else. It's rooted in truth, in courage, in wholeness. And wholeness is what changes everything. Wholeness doesn't mean you never get triggered again. It doesn't mean the memories vanish or that you never feel anger, sadness, or disappointment. Those emotions are still part of your humanity, but now you witness them. You hold space for them without being consumed. You recognize the difference between pain that is fresh and pain that is old, pain that belongs to the moment and pain that belongs to a wound still being integrated. And that recognition gives you power. Not the power to suppress, but the power to respond with clarity instead of collapse. You don't run from discomfort anymore because you trained yourself to sit with it. You don't need others to behave a certain way to maintain your inner balance. Your peace is no longer conditional, it's internal, constructed from the slow, deliberate act of reclaiming yourself. This is what Jung meant when he said the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who you were told to be, not the role you play to survive, but the full expression of your integrated self, shadow and all. Because when you integrate the shadow, when you look at what you once feared and choose to embrace it instead of exile it, something remarkable happens. You stop projecting. You stop creating enemies out of mirrors. You stop vilifying others for expressing traits you haven't yet claimed in yourself. And that brings you a freedom most people never experience. You stop being reactive because you're no longer disowning parts of yourself. And when you're no longer fragmented inside, no one on the outside can fracture you. People who are used to the old you, the you who over-explained, who apologized for existing, who bent until you broke, they'll be confused. Some might call you arrogant now, or selfish, or cold. That's not your problem. You're not here to remain digestible to people who only knew you in your unhealed form. You're not here to keep shrinking so they don't feel small. Your healing will offend the people who benefited from your brokenness. Let it. You're not living for their comfort anymore. You're living for truth. And truth is often inconvenient, even painful, especially for those who still need your silence to stay in denial about themselves. But this is where you must hold your ground, because as you continue to grow, the temptation to explain your evolution will come. You'll want to be understood. You'll want to soften your power so others don't feel threatened. Don't. That's the trap. That's the pattern you're breaking. You don't need to be understood by those who refuse to understand themselves. You don't need to justify boundaries that protect your energy. You don't need to dilute your truth to maintain someone else's illusion. The version of you that once begged for love, who accepted crumbs, who stayed silent to avoid being abandoned, she served a purpose. He kept you safe. But that version is not who you are anymore. Let them rest. Your nervous system knows. It feels the difference. You used to feel activated all the time, always on edge, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. That's no longer your baseline. Now, there's space, there's breath, there's choice. And in that space, you reclaim your agency. You realize you don't have to respond to every message. You don't have to return to familiar chaos just because it's calling. You don't owe your time, your body, your loyalty to anyone who cannot meet you with the same depth you've earned through your healing. This isn't pride, this is clarity. This is the reward of walking through the fire instead of avoiding it. You begin to see others more clearly too, not as good or bad, but as projections of their own unresolved pain. You stop personalizing their behavior because you know now that most people are not relating to you, they're relating to their idea of you, or worse, their unmet needs. You can love someone and still walk away. You can forgive someone and still block them. You can hold compassion without abandoning yourself. That's the beauty of boundaries born from shadow work. They're not walls built from fear. They're doors that you close with love because you finally understand your value. Revenge was never going to give you that. Revenge is loud. Healing is quiet. Revenge requires the other person to suffer. Healing requires only that you stop suffering. Revenge says, they must hurt like I did. Healing says, I refuse to hurt myself again on their behalf. Revenge is still a tether. Healing is release. And release is what truly terrifies those who once depended on your pain, because they no longer get to define you. They no longer get to access the parts of you that were shaped by their mistreatment. You are no longer a character in their narrative. You are the author of your own. And that's where everything begins to align, not because life becomes easy, but because you're no longer at war with yourself. That inner conflict, the part of you that wanted to stay and the part that wanted to run, the part that wanted justice and the part that wanted peace, begins to dissolve. You start listening to your intuition again. You start trusting your own timing. You start honoring the feelings you used to invalidate, and you realize that being emotionally intelligent doesn't mean suppressing your anger or sadness. It means knowing when to let it move through you without letting it move you off your center. Jung taught that the psyche is not static, it evolves. It's a process, a lifelong dance between the conscious and the unconscious, between who you are and who you're becoming. And in that dance, you will falter. You will forget. You will return to old patterns briefly, only to wake up again. That's not failure. That's the work. That's how growth unfolds. Not in straight lines, but in spirals. Every loop bringing you deeper, closer to the core of your truth. The person who hurt you? They were a catalyst, nothing more. Their role in your life was to press on the bruise you hadn't yet acknowledged, to shake the mask you didn't know you were still wearing, to trigger the wound that was still open. You don't need to thank them, but you do need to release them, because you can't become whole while holding on to fragments of pain that no longer match your frequency. Let it go, not for them, for you. Let it fall. The narrative, the anger, the need to be understood, let it fall, because what's rising in you is more important. What's emerging is not just a healed version of you, but a whole one. Someone who no longer asks, "Why did this happen to me?" but instead whispers, "What is this here to teach me?" That shift is everything. That shift is liberation. And what it teaches you, if you're willing to learn, is that the person you become after heartbreak, betrayal, abandonment, after pain, is entirely up to you. That realization is where your true freedom begins. Because if someone can shatter your heart but not destroy your soul, if they can walk away from you but you still choose to stay with yourself, if they can try to diminish you but you rise even more clear and self-possessed, that's not just recovery, that's transformation. And that transformation is the only thing they can't touch. It exists beyond the reach of their memory, beyond the power of their name. It is yours alone. This is what makes individuation, the process Jung spoke of, so revolutionary. Because it's not about becoming someone better, it's about becoming someone real. Not the image, not the mask, not the survival self, but the whole you. The one who exists beneath all the strategies, all the armor, all the attempts to be good enough, lovable enough, perfect enough. You stop performing. You stop adapting your essence to fit environments that were never designed to hold your fullness. And when you do that, when you stop shrinking to survive, you start expanding to thrive. And here's the most surprising part. When you heal, you start seeing others differently too. You recognize the shadow in them without needing to fix it or judge it. You see their projections, their pain, their reactivity, and instead of taking it personally, you simply don't engage. You let people be who they are. And more importantly, you let yourself be who you are. Not everyone will come with you. Not everyone will understand the journey you're on. Some will fall away. That is not a loss. That is space. Being made for alignment. Jung once said that loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. As you evolve, that loneliness may surface, but it's a sacred kind of solitude. It's the kind that refines you, that shapes your character, that invites you deeper into your own psyche. You begin to find companionship in your own presence. You start to see solitude not as a punishment, but as preparation. Because the more you root into your true self, the more magnetic you become to people who are also doing the work. And when those people arrive, when you meet someone who speaks the language of depth, who respects your boundaries, who doesn't flinch at your shadow, you'll know. Not because they fill the void, but because they don't need to. You've already filled it yourself. They're not there to complete you, they're there to meet you. And that's the difference between relationships born from trauma and those born from truth. One is a transaction, the other is a communion. But none of that can happen until you first become that for yourself, until you sit with the parts of you that were abandoned and whisper, "I'm not leaving," until you learn to hold your own emotions without outsourcing them to someone else, until you reclaim the power you once gave away in hopes of being chosen. When you choose yourself, not as an act of defiance, but as a sacred commitment, the entire narrative changes. You stop being the victim. You stop needing revenge. You become the one who broke the cycle. And that's the real story here. Not just that someone hurt you, but that you refused to let it define you, that you didn't close your heart, that you didn't collapse into bitterness, that you took the shattered pieces and built something stronger, wiser, deeper. This is your story, not the betrayal, not the abandonment, the becoming, the remembering, the reintegration of your whole self. So, if you're still wondering what the best revenge is, here it is. It's the life you live when you're no longer ruled by what broke you. It's the joy you feel when you're no longer waiting for someone else's remorse. It's the love you give yourself that you once begged to receive. It's the boundaries you hold without guilt, the clarity that doesn't waver, the voice that no longer trembles. That's what real power looks like. Quiet, undeniable, rooted. You don't need them to see it. You don't need them to know what they lost, because you didn't lose yourself trying to keep them. And that is the victory. That is the closure. That is the final word. So, breathe, let go, come back to yourself. You are not the pain. You are the presence that witnessed it and survived. You are not the past. You are the awareness that chose to evolve from it. You are not what happened to you. You are what you've chosen to become. And if they ever do see you again, they won't recognize you, not because you've hidden, but because you've become whole.